noticed a complex, subtle experience described by several clients who were systems that I have been trying to make sense of, and that is the presentation of I Feel Blendy. I created a table here of a lot of different ways to understand how that can present and what to do. And of course, you can't read it. So you can download it from the blog post linked in the description box below. And I will go through each line next. A client who's a system might say, I feel blendy, describing this as being relatively comfortable, and that could indicate the internal process of co-conscious blending, increased permeability, with a subjective experience of shared awareness, multiple perspectives, observably thoughtful and reflective, low risk, and the therapist's clinical response would be to normalize as cooperation, and should also listen for a statement like, we're closer together. Next, what if they say, I feel blendy, and they're distressed or they're uncomfortable, which I've seen a little more often? This could indicate boundary destabilization and would have the internal experience of confusion and identity fuzziness. And you might observe increased anxiety and the client scanning the therapist. The risk is a little higher, moderate, and the clinical response should be to slow the pace of the session, to orient to the moment, to increase grounding. And you also might hear them saying something like, there's too many voices. Another statement I've heard is, I don't know who I am right now, or a fogginess, which could indicate dissociative shutdown or hypoarousal, and would be experienced with sort of a blankness or dullness. And you might observe slowed speech, flat affect. And the clinical response should be to activate gently with movement, small movement, and orienting to time and space, to the present moment. And you should look for another statement that might be something to the effect of, everything feels far away. If the client says, I don't know who I am right now, and they're conflicted, this could mean passive influence from multiple parts with an internal tug of war, and you would observe rapid topic shifts, and the clinical response would then be to help the system name competing needs and to listen for, part of me wants this and part of me wants that. If a client says, I feel fake or unreal, this likely means depersonalization at the front, or the alter who's fronting is experiencing depersonalization, which feels like a detachment from self. You may observe a distant gaze, and the clinical response should be to ground in sensory experience. Are you noting a pattern here? And you may also hear something like, I feel like I'm watching myself. So far, I've been describing these aimed at clinicians, but if you're the system, you may experience something like, everyone disappeared, and tell that to your therapist, which we would describe as, or interpret as, protective concealment, and you would experience as a quiet internal world. And the therapist might notice either relief or fear, or maybe even confusion, and the clinical response is just to validate this may be a protective function, not likely to be permanent, something that means the amnesic barriers raised up a little, maybe the influence of an editor or a gatekeeper, and the therapist should listen for something like, they went silent. If the client or you are experiencing sudden identity shifts, this is internally transitional switching, which is disorienting, and the therapist may observe pauses and confusion, and the clinical response is to encourage slow transitions as the client may describe, something changed or is changing. If a client describes the experience of a crowded mind or saying something like it's too loud inside, this can indicate high co-consciousness, and they'll feel noise and overlapping thoughts, and you may, as the therapist, observe distractibility, and the goal clinically would be to help organize internally and perhaps provide a technique like the inner committee meeting or table meeting or some kind of journaling or way to help that internal communication be more enjoyable and effective. It is definitely a part of the diagnosis of dissociative disorders to question your diagnosis. Often, this means that the host has a phobia of awareness or of feeling that it's not true since they do not have access to trauma memories. This indicates an internal experience of doubt and minimizing, and the therapist will observe intellectualizing or may even participate in that with you. The risks are doubt spirals, parts retreating, and even a therapy rupture. But the goal for the therapist, the clinical response, is to normalize protective skepticism and the very common thought, maybe I made this up. Okay, second to last one. Feeling like one person suddenly is simply a host dominance state, and the subjective experiences of a familiar identity. And what is observed is increased executive function. There's a low risk of avoidance of internal work and part suppression. And the clinical response is simply to explore the context and to notice the client saying that they feel normal today. And finally, when there's emotional flooding with blending, this can indicate boundary thinning with trauma activation. And the internal experience is, of course, overwhelming. The therapist may observe things such as tearfulness, and the risk is high for emotional flooding, trauma intrusion, and switching. So the clinical response should be to stabilize before exploring further. And they may notice the client saying that too much is happening at once or being discussed at once or experienced at once.